there were children who got caught in a riptide. They were drowning. Their mother and aunt went out into the water to rescue them. But not understanding enough about how riptides work, they too got caught. This whole family was drowned, bringing them back to the shore. In a moment's notice, these 80 people formed together to do what no one of them could have done alone. And not only could one of them not do it alone, but they were gonna die trying. 80 people coming together were able to do something that no one of them could do alone, and were able to save each other in the process. How often do we go out alone, thinking that we are gonna save someone? We are gonna fix it. We are gonna right the wrong of the world on our own. And how often do we not only fail, but we put our own life and health in jeopardy in the process? And I believe that we do that because we're not sure that we really want to be known. We're not sure that it's worth it. We have been fed a myth that says our independence is the most important quality that we can bring to the table. How many of us have said, if it gets to it, I would rather die than be a burden? Because our independence is the most important quality that we have. The problem with that is that that's a strategy that keeps us apart. It keeps us separate, and it keeps us from having real power. The power of being known, and the power to save lives together. And so, friends, we have to find a way of overcoming our fear of being known. We have to find a way of knowing our own self enough to be willing to share our stories with someone else. Now, for those of you who right now are thinking, I'm not so into this touchy-feely storytelling, getting to know you stuff, don't worry. There's a reason, and there is a method, and there is more to this than just being known for the sake of being known, although I would say being known simply for the sake of being known is pretty darn powerful. There's a reason the psalmist wrote about it. We often in church, in the UCC in particular, don't want to form tight relationships because we like to be independent. We like our church autonomy. That is the image of this basket. It is beautiful, it is startling, it is avant-garde. It couldn't hold any Legos or rice. Certainly couldn't carry water. It mostly is going to sit on your mantle being beautiful. And this is the other type of basket that is tightly woven. It's also beautiful, but has purpose. It's capable of carrying water because the grass strands, that's not the word I'm looking for, when they get wet, they plump. So not only is it already tightly woven, but it's tightly woven of a material that when it gets wet is capable of doing an even better job of what it is called to do. I'm sharing these baskets because at our Vision Summit in Pacific Northwest Conference about a year and a half ago, we started talking about what it is to get to know one another and why it matters to get to know one another. And I said, I think that as a conference, we want to have capacity to change the world. We want to be able to make a difference. And yet, we also think that we want to be a beautiful statement on a mantle. Last month, Bishop Dwayne Royster was our annual meeting's keynote speaker, and That came about in part because when I first met Bishop Royster, the first thing he ever said to me was, we were at Synod, and we had just finished passing some resolutions, and he said, witnessing is important, but I want to win. Relationships are not just about feeling good and touchy-feely stuff. So if that's what you were thinking, don't worry, I'm not going to do that to you. There is a purpose also. Relationships matter because they feel good and because I think we are called by God to share our stories and hear each other's stories, but also because when we weave ourselves tightly together, we have a different kind of capacity. We have the ability to change, as Bishop Royster would say, change the damn world. We can change the world together when we leverage the power we can have together. When we risk weaving ourselves tightly together. And so the question I like to present is, are you willing to weave yourselves a little tighter? Now I know as clergy, we are taught that it is our job to be present for other people's stories. And if we do tell one of our stories, we have to, what do they say? We have to preach from our scars, not our wounds. Well, I am a firm believer in not that. I think that some of our wounds will never heal over into scars. And if we say that we can't tell those stories because they haven't scarred over enough, because the scar tissue isn't thick enough, because maybe the wound will reopen if we tell it, well, then I think we're missing an opportunity to really be authentic with one another. So it doesn't mean that as clergy, I'm telling you to use your congregants as your therapists. Of course not. But you don't always have to wait for a scar to tell your truth. All of us can talk about our truth, whether it's a wound still or not. All of us can tell our truth, and all of us can be curious about one another's truths. So friends, we're going to do an exercise that I know some of you did already with me, but I'm going to tell you that's okay because it gets better every time. I've done this exercise now in my conference several times. We did it with our board of directors, we did it with several of our committees, we did it with some of our local churches, and then we did it in our gathering, our big fall gathering. We had 140 people, broke out in groups of 6 and 8 to do this exercise. And friends, let me tell you, people are still talking about how it changed our conference. It changed our conference to be in a room together and tell our truths. So I'm going to invite you into this exercise that I think is one of the most powerful things we can do together as church. And again, don't worry, I'm going to connect this back to the diagram. So here's the rules. You all, so you're 3 here and you're 3 here. Can you just come together so you're 6? Everybody else is, oh, you only have 3 here. 3 and 4. You guys come here so you're 7. 4 is okay, you're good. You don't want under 4. 3 people is too small. You need at least 4 people and not more than 8. While you're moving, I'm going to tell you the rules. These are important rules. First, I didn't write this down, but if it's not your turn to tell the story, don't tell your story. Don't talk when it's not your turn. It's the same thing we say to little kids, right? The story must be your story. It must be a true story. This is not the time to tell Frog and Toad. As wonderful as Frog and Toad is, it's not the time. It's time to tell your story. It has to be significant. When I first started doing this, I said, hey guys, just write down, just with like a key word, 3 significant moments in your life. And then from there, think if one of these is a story that you can tell in a small group. Now again, it's a moment. So I told you about Brian and my experience of learning of his death. I did not tell you the entire story of our friendship, the entire story of my college career, the entire story of how then I applied to seminary. It's not a retrospective life story. Those are great, but that's not what we're doing here. We're doing a moment. So think of a moment. One of the like storytelling, like the Moth, those kind of people that storytelling events, they say that the difference can be characterized as this. You take up mountain climbing, and so you do all this research, and you learn about it, and you study about it, and you buy the gear, and then a year later, no. You're standing at a mountain, looking up. That's the story you tell. You tell the moment of climbing the mountain, not the years of preparation beforehand. Right? Are there any questions? You are each going to take a turn to tell a significant story in your life. You're not going to ask that person questions about their story. You're not going to comment about that story. And you're never going to utter another word about that story. So sometimes we talk about confidentiality and we say, okay, so we're in this table together and we're going to keep this confident. So then later, when I see you again, I'll mention it. This is not even that kind of confidence. This is the kind of confidence where the story is told in this moment and then that's it. It disappears. We don't get to bring it up again later. Later on, when you see me, you don't get to say, hey, so whatever happened with No. That was my story, I told my story, and now it's done. Same thing when Tracy tells her story. And every other one of you. Are you feeling a little scared?
Yeah.
It's all right. It's good to dive into scary things. We're going to take about 15 minutes to do this. Yeah? Thank you, friends, for doing this exercise. I developed this exercise when I was first trying to explain and teach why it matters that we get to know each other, we get to know ourselves. And in doing this exercise, every time I've done it, the room has changed. What just happened here? What happened? What happened to you? What happened to the room? What happened to the air?
I discovered that I had a relationship with people that some I've known before, some I've heard their name before, some I've never heard before, but I have a relationship with many of these.
Thank you. Did everyone hear that? He discovered that he has a relationship with several people at the table in common ground, and even if he knew the person before, he didn't know that before. What happened?
I think it's okay to take off your mask and let them know who you really are, and there's no judgment.
That's right. She just said that it's okay to take off your mask and let people see who you really are, and to do that without judgment. You know what I mean? Of each other, but of oneself. Yeah.
I thought we were talking that MT-NWy quote, it's on the ground of our common brokenness, Christ becomes visible in our midst. So if you speak of changing room, maybe after sharing like that, there's more visibility.
Right. Can you come say that quote with the mic? Because I can't summarize that.
Quoting MT-NWy, I said, it's on the ground of our common brokenness that Christ becomes visible in our midst. And so maybe the room has changed in that way, more visibility.
Thank you. What else? What changed? What changed for you? What changed for your table?
Well, several of us told a story, and while we didn't all date them, it became very obvious that all of us had this sort of affirming experience in about the same time frame. And we didn't do it on purpose. Those were memories that came out at the exact same time, or roughly at the same time for all of us.
Right. So you sort of matched each other almost.
We did. It was scary.
Yeah.
A good scary.
You made a harmony, maybe.
Yeah, considering I'm born in Halloween, most things are a good scary, not a bad scary.
Right. Yeah.
I think there was a conversation that was helpful, that the distinction between wounds and scars that was very appreciated.
Right. that the distinction between wounds and scars was permission giving. I know the whole wound and scar thing, right? Like, I pretty much can't talk about my grandmother at all without crying. I don't think that means that I can't ever talk about her, right? I think we get a little bit too black and white sometimes. So one of the things that I think happens when we do this exercise is we weave ourselves a little bit tighter. We grow in our capacity to be the church together. If you ever do this exercise with someone that maybe prior to that you felt like you didn't get along with super well, or maybe prior to that they kind of irritated you a little bit, and then you do this exercise and they tell you about their divorce or their miscarriage or this horribly shameful time from when they were a kid, you never feel the same about them again. You weave yourselves tighter together when we share these kinds of stories. And we help ourselves know that it's okay to be known. So we believe in our faith that we are made in the image of God. I go back to this psalm because it's so powerful to me, this idea that God could know me so intimately and completely. And part of why I think that feels so profound and overwhelming is because most of the time we walk through our lives feeling like we have a mask, like we're not known, like we have to hide our brokenness. But if we are all made in the image of God, then we are all called to know one another in these profound and intimate ways. And it means that we can do more together. Relationships help us do ministry with rather than for others. So often when we are called into a ministry situation that is in the world, that is problematic, that is hurtful, that is scary, we want to rush in with our imperialistic Protestant ethic and save them. Save those people from themselves. But when we know one another, when we spend the time to get to know one another and weave ourselves together, then we do ministry with one another, together, not for. In listening around the Pacific Northwest Conference, we realized that relationship is not enough. Just this general term, we need to deepen our relationships. That's what we started out saying. We need to deepen our relationships. Clergy were reporting that they felt isolated. Church leaders were saying they felt isolated. They wanted more connection. They wanted to belong. They wanted to matter. They wanted to be known. All of these things, we heard them over and over and over again. It was the most common theme I heard in my first initial listening session, visiting more than half of our churches. Every single church said in one way or another that they felt isolated. And not just our rural, faraway churches. In fact, it mostly came from our churches in Seattle. Because the rural, spread out churches had been working on this. They had identified this already as a problem. Our Seattle churches were naming it as kind of a secret. I know there's another church a mile and a half away, but I don't feel like I know them. The pastor and I have been serving a mile and a half away, and we've never done something together. Isolation and individualism is a part of our culture, and I think even more so in the West. So last week I was in the Southeast Conference in Atlanta. Now I think isolation and individualism and this hyper-independence that we love in America is sort of sewn into the culture of our country. There's a lot of smarter than me authors that have written about this. But I do think it is especially problematic in the West, where our culture prides itself on being rugged individuals. So initially, we started talking in PNC about how we needed to deepen relationships. But then we realized that it's not just any relationships. That our people and our churches needed to deepen relationships in what came to be about like 3 categories. We needed to focus on deepening collegial relationships. Clergy wanted to get to know their peers. Moderators wanted to get to know their peers. Treasurers, church secretaries, church music directors, church Sunday school teachers, all different types of roles. People were hungry for developing relationships with other people in similar roles. They were begging for more collegial relationality. Also, congregational relationships desperately need to be deepened. Remember how I said you do this exercise with that person that used to annoy you. Suddenly, now you know this story of this worst thing that ever happened to them, and it feels different. Well, that happens in our church too, right? We all have had church conflict because there's like a disagreement that really is not always rational, right? We just disagree with this person, or we don't like the new pastor, or she came in and she changed the way you do communion, right? We've all heard these. All of these conflicts, now they're not magically solved by relationship, but if you imagine relationship and learning and telling one of their stories and listening with curiosity, imagine that as a kind of like, like greasing the engine. It doesn't fix the engine, but it helps it run a bit smoother, doesn't it? It helps the other interventions you're going to try work more effectively, right? Because it weaves us tighter together. It develops empathy and understanding. So our churches, our congregations need that. They need relationships amongst each other and with their clergy and lay leaders. And finally, we have to prioritize relationships in our community. Because it isn't enough for us to be this amazing, happy, relational church that's an island unto itself. When we feel called to bring God's will on earth as it is in heaven, that requires us to know our community. Right? I have heard a lot of sermons about the neighbor. Who's your neighbor? Who's your neighbor? We're always expanding the circle. Draw the circle wider. We should draw the circle wider. And also, we can't love our neighbor if we don't know our neighbor. If we don't know anything about our neighbor, it's going to be really hard to love them. So let's say we have a church that is in an immigrant community, and they say, well, there's a lot of immigrants around here, so we're going to host English language classes without asking the people first if they want or need English language classes. Or we have a church that's like, we feel really called to start a soup kitchen, even though we are in an upper middle class suburb and we're not on a bus line. We need to develop communal relationships so that we know how to be neighbors, so that we can weave ourselves more tightly together with our community. Does that make sense? And one more slide and then I'm going to have to open it up for questions. So, this is sort of the final product, so to speak. In the center 3 circles, this is the ministry that I believe we are called to do in order to create the necessary conditions for vitality. And yet, in order to do this, to do it well, to do it authentically, to do it truthfully, to do it in ways that are with instead of for, we need to develop this outer circle of relationality. I really like to say it's a gravitational force. Because I don't know if you know very much about the way gravity works, but it's gravity that keeps the Earth in the solar system. If there wasn't gravity, Earth would just be like spinning out into nowhere and doing all that. Gravity that keeps us spinning just perfectly close enough to the sun that we can live and thrive. Right? And same with our relationships. When we work to develop our collegial, congregational, and communal relationships, we develop a kind of gravity that helps us do the ministry that we're called to do. So now I'm going to open up for questions, and then we'll move on to the more active time. Right, questions? Is everybody sleepy? Do you want to stand up and like stretch? Yeah, it's like after lunch.
I'm sorry, what you said?
And I'm on the conference staff. So just take a minute to stretch and then, oh yeah, great, you have a question.
Yeah, would you talk a little bit more about the connection of storytelling to make all of this go?
Yes. Yeah, so, in the workbook section that we're going to get to, we're going to talk about who are some of the people that we need to reach out to and develop relationships with. Storytelling in this kind of format is not something that you necessarily want to do with every person that you meet. But it's an opportunity to practice taking off your mask and getting in touch with what motivates you and listening to what motivates others. Because what you're going to see is that what's really valuable when you're developing your relationships, collegial, congregationally, and communally, is asking questions that get at what animates this other person, what concerns this other person, what makes this person get up out of bed every morning, and what makes this person worry in the middle of the night. And learning about our stories is like a primer for that. Yeah.
So as I think about this, I can picture certain churches that I think, yeah, this is kind of why I see them doing well. They really do have these pieces kind of going. But I don't see yet, so when we look at congregations and communities that aren't, is it the storytelling process that helps them to do this?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think storytelling is like a technique that helps deepen the relationships. So I would say it's the relationality that helps do this. A lot of what gets in the way of congregations thriving is that they are irrelevant. If not the majority of what gets in the way of them thriving.
Right.
They're irrelevant. Nobody particularly cares if they're there or not. Their people maybe don't care that much. Their community doesn't care that much. They're not relevant. Irrelevancy comes in part because of not knowing each other, right? It's very hard to be a relevant church in a community when the church doesn't really know the community.
We don't know them.
Right.
Because I read the report and I see 3 churches identified as potential closing churches.
Right.
I don't know any of those churches,
Right.
but I'm a member of the congregation.
Right. Yeah, so part of what exists, I think is really important in the communal sphere of relationship is not just getting to know the geographical community, but the community of churches that you're a part of. So you're all part of a community of churches that is the Northern Wyoming Conference. That's part of your community. It's important that you all know each other, that you deepen your relationships to one another, so that you can weave yourselves tighter, so that you can, I'm the kind of person that's always like, oh, what about this crazy idea? Like, what about this crazy idea? What about that crazy idea? And the thing is that most of the time, the crazy ideas that seem too crazy are because we just don't have a foundation yet for doing that, right? Developing relationality builds a foundation for almost anything that you think might come, right? So I was just speaking with the pastor who's doing your conference who was at one time in the Bellingham Church. And so the Bellingham Church in our conference is just now doing a capital campaign to raise funds to like retrofit their basement into being a day center for homeless youth in the Bellingham area. Now, that basement had been there for over a decade. The relationship that the church developed with the Northwest Youth Services had been existing for 2 decades. They'd had a relationship with this organization in town. They didn't know why they had a relationship. They didn't know why they had this basement. They just didn't know. They just trusted that at some point it would come together. So decades later, the Northwest Youth Services says, you know, our facility is really too small to do the ministry we feel called to do. And they decided to partner together to renovate their basement to become their new day center. That couldn't have happened if they wouldn't have spent the time building relationships, even when they didn't know where that was going. So one of the things that we struggle with is we get really into this kind of scarcity mindset, that we only want to do things that we can see what their impact is. But relationality is this thing where we have to invest in it, trusting that something's going to come of it. So in our conference, the Pacific Northwest Conference, our churches are not really deeply, tightly woven together. That's something that we are deciding now to prioritize. That we want to weave our churches tighter together so that when some of our churches get to a place where they are discerning if they need to close, they might be able to discern a new option because of the relationships that they have formed with the other churches in their community. Does that make sense?
Well, going back to your analogy or the story that you shared of the people out in the water, is that risk only happens through the trust of holding someone else's hand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that those people ventured out into a place where they shouldn't go because they were holding hands.
Right. Right, and I think one of the things that bothers me about that story is that I'm trying to say, like, oh, you have to do this, like, slow, hard work of getting to know each other, and these people, like, banded together in a second.
Right.
The difference, though, also is that the people drowning were screaming for help. How many times have one of our churches screamed for help? Because I literally have never seen that.
Because we can do it on our own,
Right,
or we'll die trying.
right,
That's that total independence thing.
right. So I think that immediate action can sometimes work, but it usually doesn't come up because most of the time we're not willing to scream out saying, help me.
Right now, I think the campus.
So I guess the question is, how is your conference going to respond? Right now.
I don't think many people heard what you said.
The camp is screaming for help. So I heard a story back when I was still in Baltimore about a local church that had done really great work in the community of getting to know the community and providing space for all the groups that needed it. They really became like a community center. They hosted 12-step meetings, they hosted the Boy Scouts, they hosted after-school programs, they had a preschool. They did all this amazing stuff. And yet they still were in a situation of really dwindling financial resources. And then it got to a place, though, where their roof went, and they needed to replace the roof. And it was going to be, I have no idea how much money, some ridiculous sum of money, $80,000. And the church couldn't afford it. So they made the difficult decision, just themselves, they decided that they needed to close their doors. They were going to close the church, sell the building. They sent out a letter to all of their tenants saying, I'm sorry, but you have 1 month left before we have to sell the building. We're very sorry that we cannot continue to rent space to you, but we're selling our building. All of the tenants then came together and through a massive fundraiser and appealed to their constituents and raised the money for the church's roof. So the church could stay open. And the church learned that being in relationship also means asking for help before you're dying. You know, I know another church in our conference that does amazing things with their high schools right next to them. They're right next to the high school property. They do so much to support the high school. So when I went out there and I was like, well, you know, you gotta really work on your community connection. And they're like, what are you talking about? We do all that. We're doing all that. And I was like, oh, like I didn't realize that because you told me you had this really awful budget deficit. How is the community supporting you? Silence. It had not occurred to them to ask the high school or the PTA or the community or the boosters or any of the groups that they were to support if they would help to support the church in return. It's okay to ask for help.
Relationships work both ways.
Relationships work both ways. That's what makes them relationships, right?
One-way streets do not work well.
Right, but it is part of our, I would say, Protestant ethic and arrogance and patriarchal worldview that makes us want to fix everyone else. And we would rather die than admit we need help. We'd rather die than be dependent. We'd rather die than be a burden.
Did they ask?
This is still very new. We'll see. They did get an anonymous donation. So are there other questions so far? Yeah.
So, in ministry, as a pastor, there's kind of a, I don't know, it's spoken, it's said directly, but it's also indirectly said that there are some ethical issues with oversharing on the part of the pastor with the congregation. That includes with our sermons and in our personal relationships and with groups. And I find myself in conflict with, that's a very powerful, ongoing, historically present, cultural passing along that we do informally. And so I'm wondering, is there, I don't know, it feels like a conundrum to me, and I'm not quite, it's something to really overcome. If we're really going to embrace being in a relationship in a truthful way where we're telling our stories, and it feels risky to me, and I'm not sure how willing most pastors are, or churches are, to really truly engage in what you're talking about because of this, I'm just expressing my, concerns about it, and I really, truly, really do embrace what you're saying, and I have been accused of oversharing and, with negative connotations.
Right.
And so I'm just sort of curious about, and I'm addressing everybody in this room too. This is operating underneath all of us, and I just bringing it up.
Right, thank you. I feel like I sort of hinted that, but I do want to say more about it. What we're doing when we tell these stories is we're furthering a public relationship that is vulnerable and truthful. But it's not a private, vulnerable relationship, right? One of the ways that you can tell the difference between that is because I'm not going to walk out of here and grab Mark and ask him to, pray with me while I cry about my story I told, right? That's it, I told the story. If I need more help processing that story, that's on me to go get that help. So this is part of why we practice telling our stories that are real and vulnerable, is because we do often create this dichotomy that says we either have to be aloof and rigid and inauthentic, or we're like our bubble jelly self, right? That's just not, it doesn't have to be that dichotomy, right? I can tell a story that is truthful and meaningful and vulnerable to me and not put you all in the position of caring for me about it. That's, I would say, a really clear distinction. The other thing I do want to acknowledge is that there are gender and race dynamics at play.
Yes.
It is much, much easier for our white male clergy to tell stories of their vulnerability and everyone swoon and think it's adorable. It's just how it is. Women and people of color have to be more careful about the way that we tell our stories. And we have to be more careful about making clear our boundaries in between telling our stories. That's just, that sucks, sorry. That's just true though. In my church, I had to really do work to talk with them about how it's not inappropriate that my children come to worship. That it's their church too. That kids want to come to worship. But some people felt like it was unfair that my kids get to come to work with me. Well, they had never had a female pastor before. They never had a female pastor before. It's different to see a man pick up his baby, and it's so cute. And they're so supportive and wonderful, and they're a great dad. And when a woman does that, it's perceived as somehow her attention is divided. Right? There just are gender dynamics in the church that we have to be aware of. I don't think that means that we can't do this. It is harder to make clear our boundaries. So, for instance, if I were to tell a story and somebody were to come and care for me, I would very clearly say, thank you for your concern, I'm doing okay. Right? Because I think that's where that line gets blurred, is when we as clergy are asking our congregations to care for ourselves, care for us. Does that make sense? And there's probably other ways to phrase that as well.
Well, and I think there's something to be said for the fact that when you have someone who, let's say you have a new pastor move in, and you've selected that person, you've gone through the process, and what they've done is they've swept a couple of really big deal issues in their personal lives under the rug, thinking, we're going to pick up, we're going to move, we're going to change where we are, and therefore, those things are going to take care of themselves. And they don't always. And when you don't deal with those things, eventually they implode. Right? And you watch maybe a couple who's moved there have their entire marriage disintegrate because they didn't say up front, you should be aware. Not because we want people to say, oh dear, but so that you can then say, how can we support you as you move through this?
Right.
And when you don't support them because you don't see the problems, then you can't help to affect the change.
Right.
And that's true not just of pastoral relationships, but that's also true of people who come into your church and or go out.
For sure. I mean, I think we in the UCC we have some resources that really help with conflict. I know Mike's doing a healthy congregations training thing, and there's some good resources to do that. This is not going to replace that, but this does help us understand why relationships that are honest and truthful are worth investing in. Right? I'll say that at my church, it was a very hard adjustment for them to have a young female pastor. And I think the only way that I did not get fired is because I did a lot of one-to-one meetings where I went and I listened and I talked to people and I heard from them. And, I heard them say, well, I don't mind this, but some people, you hear that enough and you're able to address it. You're able to talk about it. You're able to shine some light on it, right? Like they say that sunlight is the best antiseptic. Right? Well, we can't learn what's festering and infected and broken if we're not asking and listening, right? So, yeah. But conflict is real. Yes?
So, to bring this back out again, the idea of telling our story to the larger community and inviting stories to come in, I think there's a little bit of concern that the larger community doesn't care about hearing the story of our churches or hearing the story of the gospel.
Right.
Because there's been such an inoculation against the name of Jesus. Some people have just decided, I'm not going to use the word at all. So what advice do you have on that?
I would say that the reason why a lot of our communities are not interested in hearing the story of our church is because our church has not spent the time being interested in hearing the story of the community. Right? There was a time when most of our churches were the center of the community, and somewhere between that time and now, there grew a widening gulf of lack of connection. And so now, when we are in the last 10 years or so, when we've really acknowledged church decline, and we're really frantic about it now because we're anxious, we want to go out and preach our story and expect people to be, amazed, overcome, struck by the gospel? I mean, sure, it happened some. It happened to me, but I don't think that's usual. And it certainly didn't happen because there was like a televangelist or something that caught me, or even a pastor. If anything, it was the opposite. It was bad church experience after bad church experience that made me think, this is almost right, but not quite. I think that very often our churches don't know what's going on with our communities. We don't really have the pulse. We don't know the gossip. We don't, we're not invested, right? So one thing, right, so if there's something happening in your community, around your church, right, and your pastor is one of the first people to be called by a community leader, that means you've done some important relational work in that community. If there's a town hall meeting and there's like a angry eruption of the people and you don't hear about it until Sunday, then maybe you're not totally on the pulse of the community, right? That's not a criticism. It's just a sign like, what can we do to get to know the community better? And that's some of the exercise we're going to go through.
I think the focus of family is a big issue in general for all of us. The focus of family, especially with children, it's the scheduling of sporting events on Sunday.
Right.
And one of the biggest issues
Yeah.
Right.
we face conflict. Before, the only thing you did on Sunday morning was go to church,
For sure.
and that's changed.
Yeah, it totally has.
You go hiking, you go to kids' soccer games, you go to all these things. And so this younger generation, church is no longer
These
the
kids.
thing to do on Sunday morning.
Right. So I have a lot of thoughts about that because I have 3 kids. But I will also say in this pink circle here, when I talk about spiritual practices, I think it's possible, this is something radical I'm going to say, don't quote me, I think it's possible that Sunday morning worship might just be on its way out. I don't think that means churches, and I don't think that means spiritual practices are. I think it's true that a lot of people just, Sunday morning worship doesn't do it for them. It's not compelling enough or exciting enough or worth it enough for them to do that. So they're going to go to soccer or baseball or whatever. We can choose to be irritated and annoyed by that, or we can choose to find out what are some of the ways that those people might be fed spiritually, not on Sunday morning. Right? So, also, and I didn't say this, I'm realizing I missed some things here. This model of vitality is not necessarily saying that your Sunday morning butts and pews number is going to grow. Right? If you notice in the UCC reporting form, we used to just track attendance. Now we track impact. Do you know what I'm talking about or not? Okay. Sorry, I also have like a throat loss because I'm sick. Starting to move on. So, a few years ago now, maybe 4 years ago or so, Mark, how long has it been? I think 4 years ago or so, the UCC started asking for your number of people that you impact in an average week or month. And that might be through your preschool, through your 12-step groups, through your feeding ministry, through your whatever thing you do beyond Sunday morning. This vision of vitality might increase your Sunday morning worship. It also might just increase your other ways of being active and relevant as a church community. Does that make sense?
But a good distinction.
It is. Yeah.
One thing that is, going back to telling stories and getting to know the community, it strikes me that we're not all locked in the church 7 days a week.
Right.
And so the people who are participating in our congregations and the whole life of our church are in the community. So if we are coming back and talking to each other and telling stories and saying, this powerful thing happened this week, or my kid's teacher's out of school supplies again, that helps us to be connected to the community just because who's inside.
Yes, exactly. And I will say that this way of thinking about vitality is easier for churches that are not like commuter churches. So some of our churches are commuter churches where the majority of the membership doesn't live in the surrounding area around the church. This takes more intentionality and hard work then to get to know the community. Churches where the majority of the membership are like walking or driving a couple miles, this is way easier for you because you're already the community. Now, you might not represent all of the community, and that's where you have to be intentional about reaching out. But you know, if you're a church that's membership is composed of the neighborhood, and you have teachers, lawyers, doctors, plumbers, tech people in your congregation, which is not that unlikely, right? Then you have the community, right? Get to know each other. Get to know what issues you're struggling with. Get to know what keeps you up at night and what makes you get out of bed in the morning. It is way easier for those churches. Are we good? Sorry, I'm really feeling embarrassed about my cough drop situation and my voice.
Doing fine.
Okay,
As long
thanks.
as you don't lose it entirely until you're done talking.
Right, okay.
Keep going till you die.
Okay, so the workbook. So the last time I was out, I was hoping to come back with a workbook. And I have a kind of a draft of a workbook, but it's in PowerPoint form still. So the first thing is the power of relationships that we've been talking about. How do we translate this storytelling exercise into actually deepening relationships? The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Who's familiar with that quote? Right, so lots of people are familiar with that. How do we find what we are called to? Again, often in church, we want to focus on where our deep gladness is without necessarily finding out where the world's hunger is. Right? I mean, anybody that's ever done youth ministry and put together this really rocking youth program that no youth come to has done this. I've done it. I know I've done it. I'll admit it. I'll confess I've done it. So what does it take, though? How do we get to know actually where the world's deep hunger is so that we can meet it? Okay, so relational meetings. That's one way to do it. I'm not saying it's the only way. But it's an art. There's no right way. You'll get better at it over time. And you start with learning to tell your story and cultivate curiosity for others telling theirs. So a relational meeting is a IAF. It's a community organizing terminology. Doesn't matter if you call it this, but it's sitting down with somebody and trying to build a relationship with them so that you get to know really these two key things. What gets them out of bed in the morning and what keeps them up late at night. And then ideally the third thing is if they have any interest in doing anything about it. Because lots of people have interesting issues or stories or problems, but they maybe don't have the energy or the anger or the frustration to do anything about it. There's nothing wrong with those people. They're just not necessarily going to help you change the world. So you try to figure out these things. And it's an art. It's not easy. At first it feels awkward. But if you can start out with telling your story and listening to somebody else tell theirs, that's the beginning. That's why we do the exercise we did. So, this would be great now if you were sitting in your congregational groups. Are you mostly sitting with the people that you go to church with?
No.
How would you feel about getting up, those of you that are more mobile, and moving to those places? Are you doing that? Somewhat at least? Ideally, if you can sit with the same people you go to church with on Sunday. That's what I'm saying. Okay. So I'm going to lead us through an exercise, but before I do that, I have been reminded that part of this exercise is to say that you do not have to go and listen to every single story and tell your story to every single person you meet or know. That is not what I'm telling you to do. You don't have to do that, right? We are going to spend some time actually making priority lists of who are the people that you want to meet with. By definition, that means not everybody's going to be on the list. Does that make sense? It's not a criticism. If you're a pastor and you have a lay leader that is not on the list, it does not mean you stop providing pastoral care for them. It means that maybe they're not the top of the list of the people that you need to meet with in order to weave your basket tighter. Do you hear the difference? Yeah? Okay. So, maybe with that we should start with the congregational one. So who are the members of your congregation that you need to deepen relationships with? These are some prompting questions. I want you to make a list of at least 5 people in your congregation that you think it would be valuable for you, maybe 5's too many, you can do 3 to 5, I'll say that you think are making an influence, or making an impact, they have influence, you can learn something from them, they challenge you, or they're struggling with something important, and you want to work through that with them. And again, when I say struggling, I don't tend to mean struggling with like mental health issues. I mean struggling with, I mean more struggling with their kid really needs to be on the free and reduced lunch program. I mean, they are about to be kicked out of their low-income housing. I mean concrete kind of struggling, not emotional struggling as much. Not there's anything wrong with emotional struggling. I'm talking about concrete things here. So make your list.
And are we supposed to make them individually?
You're supposed to make them individually, but like talking to each other. Each person has a list, but definitely talk about your list. Does that make sense? Work together, but nobody gets out of it. This is weaving our basket tighter together, and we do that by strategically prioritizing certain relationships. We started with trying to prioritize by making a list of 3 to 5 people in our congregation that either have an impact, they have influence, they have something important you can learn from them, they challenge you, or they're struggling with something and you want to work with them on that. With, not for. Right. So, not surprisingly, you're going to do this also, though, for your community and with your colleagues. So before we try to do that, what questions, I'm guessing some questions came up because this took you a very long time. So what came up for you in trying to make this list? Why was it so difficult?
Part of it was trying to figure out, getting clear on why we were doing it.
Oh, okay.
Because I think there was a sense that we're doing it to get more butts in the pew, as you say.
Oh.
And it's like, no, that's not what we're after here, and that changes the list, you know.
Right. So thank you for asking that question. I can be more clear on that. So within the congregational list here, your goal is to increase your capacity as a congregation. So that's why you want to deepen relationship with people who are like really on fire and intense and they have a lot going on. Or, and this is a tricky point. This one's very tricky, I think, for pastors. You also sometimes have to prioritize a deepening a relationship with somebody who often serves as an obstacle. Right? If you have a powerful matriarch or patriarch in your church and they can block anything that anybody suggests, you gotta prioritize a relationship with them. Because they have power. That's one of the things that power does, is power means you have the ability to make impact, to have impact. Right? If there's somebody in your church with a lot of power, they need to be on your list. Does that make sense? Right, I'm not saying you necessarily want to, but maybe as you get to know them, you know, it'll change. Right? I had this church patriarch in my last church who really wielded a tremendous amount of power. He was one of the most conservative people in the church. He was constantly trying to make me into a baker, like a Martha Stewart type of woman, which I am not. He was very offended that my husband actually bakes. He felt very strongly about a lot of things, and people listened to him. At the same time, though, because I somehow, thank God, was smart enough to prioritize building a relationship with him, When we got to a place where this church was not O&A and where we had a same-sex couple coming and they wanted to get married in our church, and it was the summer, so the council was not in session, I went and I met with him and I said, here, this is the deal. This is what's going on. And he said, well, you know what, Courtney? I don't agree with same-sex marriage. But I also think that the pastor has the authority to make these decisions, and the pastor always has. And the council has never voted on any wedding in this church ever. So I did the wedding. And then at the next council meeting, he said exactly what he just said. And the council not only, they didn't vote on the wedding, they said that they will reaffirm the, the freedom of the pulpit and the pastoral authority of the pastor. That was the first time they had affirmed my authority as the pastor, officially. I just got lucky enough to know to meet with him. So, he was a big pain in the butt. But if people have power, you have to meet with them. Because that's how you can tighten your basket to build more capacity to do stuff. If I didn't have a relationship with him, I was never going to be able to do the stuff that I wanted to do in the church. So while you're thinking about your church, go ahead.
Is one of the keys to figuring out who to put on the list the people that you would really rather not have on your list?
Probably. Yeah. But I would be careful though, because there's a difference between people who are kind of a thorn in your side, but don't really have very much influence. Often those people suck a lot of your time. Right? That I would say that is one of the hallmarks of a church, of a pastor that is going to burn out. Is that they get sucked into giving a lot of time to problems or issues or congregants that complain a lot but don't necessarily have a lot of impact. Right? You continue to provide pastoral care for those people. You do not put them on your strategy list. Does that make sense? Right. So as you're doing that list now, I want you to start thinking about your community list. Who are the people in your community? Now, very often, these are people in your community, again, that have power and influence, that know what's going on. Often, I would say, unless you already have a number of school administrators and teachers in your congregation, at least one person on your list needs to be a local school administrator. The local schools are at the pulse of the community pretty much always. Unless you live in a community where there's no kids. But for the most part, public school administrators know what's going on in the community. And usually they're pretty happy to sit down and talk with you about it because no one asks them. Go. How was this experience of developing your lists? Anybody want to share that it was fun or challenging or weird? How was this experience for you? Tracy?
When we were talking about the congregational people, we kind of came up with some lists for both of us, and then we kind of went back after we did after we did community, we kind of went back and said, oh yeah, who are the people with power though? And so, we kind of had to refine it.
Right.
And I suspect that we're gonna be continuing to refine.
Right. Right. So, yeah.
I found the idea of the lists and the 3 lists helpful. I found it challenging to do in group process.
Okay.
I think it would probably be easier for me to take those categories and sit at my desk and work on them.
Right. I'm an extrovert, so I assumed that would make it easier.
That's right, there are a few introverts in the room.
Right. So introverts are always welcome to just, do it by themselves. Yeah.
I'm the only person here from northern Wyoming, and I think it would be easier to have had a group of people, because these are all my opinions. These are, if I...
Your opinions matter.
Yeah.
Right. And the people who show up.
Right. Your opinions matter. You have power and influence.
Right. Okay. Let's just go back and tell them we have to contact all these people.
Well, no, so what I was going to say...
You go back and you make them do this with you, and you now get to be the one who carries this forward and say, this is something that I found exciting. I want you to do it with me and see where we dovetail, where I can help you. And you're going to be amazed at what happens.
Okay, we have a couple more comments here.
As somebody who knows Gene and served in Sheridan, I know your list is already accurate. So you'll just be on this list.
I think it might be one of those like truisms too, right? Like your list can't be wrong for you. Right? Yeah.
I'm still so new that when I left my office on Wednesday afternoon, I still didn't have a desk. So I found the exercise to be overwhelming. But beyond that, John had a great point, and I can speak for you, sir, that it gets really compelling to focus on tasks. Let's identify the project, because as soon as you name the thing, it's like, I want to do something, make a plan, and fix it. And this is about relationship for the sake of relationship. And that the generative task follow-up thing may happen immediately, may happen 10 years down the road.
Right. I would add though, it's also about capacity.
Yes.
Right? So one way of checking your list is to look at your list now and think, maybe don't look at the list, but I'm saying one of the questions in my mind when I first started that was really helpful to me was somebody said, who are the people that could block a new initiative? That means they have power. Who are the people that could just make a program happen at your church? They have power. Right? Not necessarily the people that do the most tasks. Right? You're right. Because it's not just about tasks, it's about capacity, building capacity together. Now I'm not just saying like we have this really weird relationship with the word power, where we think that power is always oppressive, it's always unjust, it's always bad. But when I talk about power, I mean the ability to act, ideally with rather than for. Okay? So I'm not talking about oppressive power, although sometimes the power is oppressive. But you can leverage that into helpful power. Yeah.
I made the 3 lists and they came pretty quickly. And they always are somewhere in the back of my mind, I guess. But I think what's important is to keep asking the question.
Yes.
To keep asking and
Thank you.
asking the question. And if you don't keep that question forefront, who do I need to reach out to?
Right.
And
so yeah, I would say you keep that question forefront for yourself.
And for myself and go ahead.
And for every time you have a meeting, the best way to wrap up your meeting is to say, and who else should I be talking to? Right? Because if you just met with the church patriarch, he probably knows some stuff. And if you ask him, who should I be talking to? He probably has a good idea. Right? And the same thing if you met with somebody that's influential in your neighborhood. Right? So
And those people might not necessarily be the same, but they're going to complement each other.
Exactly. Right. So part of why I made you do 3 lists is because it's important that we develop relationships around all 3 of these categories. Right?
You know what I found was that the 3 lists, although we do live in a very small town, the 3 lists, there are names that are on all 3 lists.
Right. Right. That happens. Names that are on all 3 lists, and that happens. And that probably means those people are really important to me with. So I would challenge you actually to first to start with your list for you. I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit. I don't remember your name, but just start with your list. Think about how much time you can give to this project. Think about how many meetings you can do in a week. You have to be able to do at least 1 meeting in a week, because I'm not talking about a 4-hour meeting. I'm talking about a 30-minute meeting. Right? And can I spare 1 30-minute chunk of time each week for the next 9 to 15 weeks? Or if you're really, 2 a week. Right? And once you get started with this, then you can start talking about it, right? If you're here with already a group from your church, that's the best. Because you can get together and be like, so what did you learn? What did you hear? What got bubbled up for you? Because so one of the things that I learned I just had to write a grant. And I learned this really amazing evaluation terminology. It's called emergent theme coding. I didn't know that term before, but I I think it's something most of us do anyway.
Can you say it again?
Emergent theme coding. So you listen, and the themes that emerge are the ones that you keep track of, right? So you do more and more listening. So in my case, in PNC, right away, I started hearing a lot about isolation. So then I would go back to the council and or the board and the staff and say, I keep hearing about how our clergy feel isolated. And then I'd go and I'd do some more listening, and I'd say, even our lay people say they feel isolated. And then I did some more listening, and I was like, I'm still hearing that pretty much all of our churches feel isolated. And every time I said that, I would see this. That makes sense. I feel like that too. That resonates for me. If people had said, oh, really? I don't think that's right. then maybe I wouldn't have been listening good, right? So you listen, try to notice what themes come up, then share them with each other and see if it resonates. Try to find the themes that resonate so that when you say, I'm hearing this, people are nodding. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's agreeing either, though, because sometimes what happens is that you do some good listening and you hear about a theme in the community that just no one knew about. So in my last church, the church was outside of Baltimore City in the county in what was considered to be a pretty middle-class neighborhood. And I found out in listening in the community, listening to our school administrators especially, that we had a high percentage of students on free and reduced lunch. And I don't remember what that exact percentage was, but it was high enough to be significant, and yet not high enough that the state would pay for subsidized summer meals. So our neighborhood was caught in this middle spot where there were families experiencing food insecurity, but not enough families to where the state would do anything about it. Or no, not the state, that's a federal program. Sorry, the summer meal program is a federal program. And we fell just under the threshold for that. So when I started talking about that in my church, people were shocked. Because it was a pretty middle-class neighborhood. People were really surprised that there were so many food insecure families. But once they went out and they started noticing and asking their kids if they're friends or, they started noticing, then it started to resonate. But they hadn't known that before. Sometimes that will happen, right? Where the theme that emerges is a little bit surprising at first. So what you want to do is you want to do these meetings and you want to listen and you want to share your story and you want to listen for other people's stories and you want to see if certain themes emerge. Does that make sense? Right. So we don't have a ton of time and we're tired. So I'm going to just run through this last bit. So in the ministry, the workbooky part of the ministry is how do we do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly? So, what's the word? Baseline, right? So part of the benefit of also, there's a word in evaluation that's called the baseline. So it can help if you start out by looking at what your church is doing now in terms of committees or ministries that are doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly. And just write them all down in 3 circles, right? And then just put it aside until you get through your 15 weeks of meetings. Then take it back out and say, when I think about the themes that have emerged, as we've shared, that what we've heard in the community, in the congregation with our colleagues, are there areas that maybe we want to let go of and other areas that maybe we want to lean into? Does that make sense? Okay, well. There, that's the circle I was trying to get to. Okay, so basically the last bit is just to do this thinking about what your church currently does. That's your baseline. Go to your listening, then come back to it and say, now thinking about the Buechner quote, right, where I always mess this up, our gladness meets the world's hunger, right? Is what we're doing really meeting the world's hunger? Or is there other stuff that we're being called to do? Are there other ways that we can live into our sense of calling, of doing what we feel equipped to do, but that more thoroughly meet the world's needs? And then, get out your eraser area marker or whatever, change. But at that point, you'll be having some good information with which to vision your future, instead of just picking randomly what you feel like, right? All right, that's it. That's all I got.
The thing that I didn't hear you say about the people quote, that I think is also sometimes a temptation, especially if you're doing this stuff like going out and listening to people, is that this thing will emerge, you know, oh my God, half the community is starving, or whatever, you know. I don't have any energy for that at all. It is not my passion. It is not my deep gladness.
Right.
But somehow I'm supposed to do it because that's what's there.
Right.
And
Right.
you gotta have both halves of that equation for it to be where God's called.
For sure. Thank you for asking that question, actually. That is where it's very important that you've been developing relationships across different sectors, because sometimes it is your job to not do it, but to connect people who can do it, who are called to do it, right? It might not be your calling to do, in my congregation, we got involved in adult survivors of domestic violence organization, or no, adult survivors of childhood violence. And it wasn't something that I really felt like I wanted to invest my time in. I did not feel called to that. But I did happen to know that we had an adult survivor in our congregation. And I was able to help plug her into this network. And the Central Atlantic Conference passed a resolution at the last synod about this, in part because we had this connection to do it. So yeah, you're right. It is not always going to be your thing. That's why you do all these different types of meetings, so that you know what is our congregation called to do, what are our gifts and skills, what are the community's gifts and skills, right? And that's the other reason why I draw it as a Venn diagram, right? Like, everything is about trying to find where there's an intersection, where there's an overlap, where there's a resonance. Right? And just one last thing about that. So, and it's always okay to partner with other groups. We don't have to do everything ourselves.
Courtney, we are really blessed here in the conference to have you here twice. Courtney, as you may gather, is the foremost church vitality person in the UCC. And to be right next door in the Pacific Northwest Conference.
Right.
Wonderful, thank you.